All right, we are on air. Welcome, everyone. This is Kal Holczler. I'm here with Daniel, and we're going to be speaking about suffering. The title of this podcast or this conversation is What is Suffering? And it's my intention that this conversation will lead to insights to whoever is listening to this, and we'll have some fun while we're talking about a conversation that I believe most human beings can relate to. So what is suffering? What a question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm Kal. I have to say I'm really happy to be a part of this this production. And both of us approach this project with the idea that is it going to be one episode or 1,000 episodes? Only time is really going to tell. And you kind of think to yourself, is suffering something that would it be old? Would it get old as soon as you explain the pains that have tormented you or some of the pains that have tormented society? Can we kind of get through that list, and then will it get old? And I think this is an ongoing eternal question, because the idea of suffering really counterpoints with flourishing. And
Right.
From a Greek sense, you get into a whole conversation of eudaimonia and happiness. So I really don't think we can exhaust that topic, right?
Yes. I have thought a lot about it since we decided to pick this topic, given, the topic came from some of the conversations we've had and some of my past experiences. And I look toward some sages, or I look toward some philosophers, and I look toward intellectual giants that I respect, that are alive today. Obviously, this topic, I think humanity has had this conversation of what is suffering from beginning of time. I think every religion, at the focal point of the religion, and every philosophy at the focal point of the philosophy is what is suffering. Either what is it so we can do less of it, or what is it, which brings the existential question to why are human beings suffering? Is it inevitable? Is it a constant? Do we invite it into our lives? Is it thrusted upon us? Is there a way of not experiencing it? Or is there a way, like I look at, for example, Jordan Peterson, and I look at other giants that, he is an individual that I very much respect, and also very much look as an embodiment of a particular ideal. Now, I'm not saying an enlightenment, and I'm not saying mastery. I'm saying, in this particular context, it's a mastery of, like, he doesn't stop being inquisitive into the nature of humanity, into the human experience. And for him specifically, not too long ago, and still current, it's suffering. So it's like, what is suffering? Are Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp, obviously he was in a concentration camp, but could we say that he suffered less because he had a particular context around his suffering? Meaning, was he able to diminish the suffering because he had a vision of a better tomorrow? Obviously, that vision of the tomorrow, or a vision of a better day, was still in the present. He was being tortured, literally starved to death, while seeing people that he had deep conversations with or shared a smile with the day before is now just a corpse. So where's the intersection of hope, aspiration, a vision of tomorrow, give credence or give context to suffering? Meaning, is suffering this thing that always boils up in us and we can't escape it? But if you have some grace, and if you have some context around you live your life, you can kind of place it in its proper place, and you kind of use it as a focal point to come back to prayer, come back to positive thinking, come back to better living, come back to engaging in healthy behavior and how you want to build your life. Like, what is it? Like, I think this question is so insanely deep. It's not just like, what is suffering? It's like, what is the difference between suffering and pain? To what degree can we really escape it? Or can we say Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp was not suffering because he did X, Y, and Z? Or did he still suffer, but he was able to put it in the right context. I mean, like, it's ginormous. Like when somebody thinks on, how am I going to pay my bills? Or why is my family member suffering and in pain, like a physical ailment? Like, can we say that there are particular practices that they do in a particular ecstatic trance of faith that they place themselves into, and all of a sudden they are not suffering because they're believing that what's happening to them and to the others around them has a higher purpose? Or no, they're still suffering, but you're willing to, like, that's the whole nature, the whole idea of being on the cross. It's like, no, it is in the suffering that I find my creator. It's in the suffering that I find my humanity. It's in the suffering that I find empathy for others that are suffering as well. And I can join in this community of understanding and love and compassion toward others. I mean, I think a lot of what we're going to do in this show, and hopefully as we invite other people and maybe some authority figures on the topic, and maybe others that are just engaged in the human experience and have experience with suffering, is what is it? What are truly, what are people's understanding of it, and what's their experience at either with getting rid of it or utilizing it, alchemizing it, transforming it, right?
Yeah. Well, you throw a lot there, and let me see if I can kind of unravel some of the. You went right to the Holocaust, so there's no. We'll just go right for it, right? So, I mean, the singularity of the Holocaust is like, let's say that nothing has quite happened like that in history up until that point. Kind of. We get some disagreement, but
I mean, my grandparents were in it. My entire family prior to my grandparents were wiped out in the Holocaust on both sides. And I am not willing to say, oh, no people have ever suffered like this in this capacity and this particular number and this particular our entire history is painted with this exact behavior. The genocide of all kinds of different people. We've been killing each other from the beginning of time, with all kinds of motivation behind it. It's tragic in every sense, but that's just been a constant. So I'm not going to say I think of the Holocaust as something that has never happened in this particular way, but it's certainly, it's for you and I, it's close enough to our memory that we have known people that lived through it, that we can say it raises some serious questions about human beings. Like, have you ever read the book Ordinary Men?
No.
Without going into too much detail, I recommend people, when they read it or listen to it, do it while you're watching the sunset or while walking on the beach or in a beautiful environment. Otherwise, it's way too depressing. And it's one of the recommended books that Jordan Peterson has on his site, and I've heard him talk about it, but it's written by almost like a investigative journalist who was able to interview and read a lot of the documents of a particular battalion of Nazis, of concentration camp guards. And he kind of goes into, like, those were ordinary men in the realest sense. They had children, they had wives, they went home to their careers. They wanted the approval of their friends. They wanted the acknowledgement of their superiors, et cetera, et cetera. The whole premise of reading the book is like, evil does not live out there in history, something we look back to, that we've evolved beyond it. Mm-hmm. Not only does it not live across the street, that evil that could burn people to death literally lives in me and in you.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to the suffering. What is suffering? And can people live life without suffering? Meaning they are not neglecting responsibilities. They are not neglecting the truth. They are not neglecting something being off about their lives. They are not very possibly you can say that when people start imposing suffering on other people, there's been many points of reference, many many important things that they've neglected, that they are in so much pain that now inflicting pain on others becomes something that they're numb to. But we all participate in that.
Yeah, you've heard about, you see this in primate species where the suffering rolls downhill on the hierarchy, right? So if the alpha is aggressive to one of the subordinates, then the subordinate is then, takes that aggression out on ones below them in their hierarchy.
You'll see that with parents and in families. Would you say that's more of a modeled behavior, or would you say that that's a way of relieving themselves of the internal intensity?
I'd even say it's a little bit. It's different. It's naturalistic, right? I mean, I don't know what the listeners subscribe to in terms of a worldview, but my background is fundamentally Darwinian. This is what I relate to when I look at my epistemological knowledge structure, and I'm not saying that I can't appreciate and inhabit a spiritual understanding, right? That's fine, but at least to augment that with the fact that we emerge from a primate species, and it's so natural, observably natural when we look at these communities of primates on how this actually happens. It's very interesting to me that we've evolved to a point with our abstract capabilities to maybe take some of that tribal aggression and just short-sighted tribal aggression and maybe rechannel that into futurity and to ideals, right? Because we were able, as Plato taught us so eloquently 2,600 years ago, is that we have these imaginary worlds that we can inhabit, and we can move abstractions into reality, right? And so, unlike any other species, we have this ability to abstract the promised land, be in a horrific situation like that, like you'd mentioned about the Nazi camps, but thinking about a different day, a future day, even if it's not for that particular person, it's for for humanity. There's some ability for us to abstract to this bigger picture, and that just comes with a different level of suffering, a different level of angst that is part of the conversation. And it's just kind of par for the course. It's just all the benefits of being able to create those wonders in our mind come with the downside of the psychologizing of the negatives and the suffering that we even inflict upon ourselves, right?
Right.
And I mean, eternally, psychologically, we inflict upon ourselves. You brought up Jordan Peterson, which is interesting, and I find that I don't tune into him on a regular basis, but I read both of his previous books, and
you read the Maps of Meaning?
Yeah, I did a huge analysis on it, actually.
Right. I remember you saying that. Yeah.
I want to point out somewhat of a. It's if I say something like player hater, you kind of know what that means. Maybe from my upbringings, I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and for some reason, I had a social group that was really into rap music, and so that reference of being a player hater, you get what that means, right? So somebody who's in this group,
as in like a rebelliousness towards his ideology.
Well, no, let's make it a little bit more simpler and say we're two dudes young at heart and we're just like hanging out in our social clubs, right? And I look at Kal over there. He seems to get the girls, and he's all fancy, clothes and everything, and he's got some game and all this kind of stuff. But when I'm around my friends, I'm like, he's just, he's not that good. He's just put you down, right?
Got it.
And I find with academics, thought leaders of the like, or people that are stepping into this space that are aware of Jordan Peterson, they could be another academic, for example, and they're like, I don't like that guy. He's this or he's that. And
Right.
In philosophy, we call them like ad hominem attacks, right? There's no reason to have this attack at somebody to rip him down based off of, how he's delivering his message. Look at, just purely on his following and the millions of book sales that he has. People are listening, and so he's doing something right.
Yeah.
Right?
A lot right. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot right. And so he's speaking to. So I try and keep the ad hominems to like non-existent, right? Just try and stay away from them. So then my framing on Jordan Peterson would go something like this. Several years ago, I had he was actually in Vancouver with in a long form discussion with Sam Harris. Remember, so it's like, I'm going to corner this guy, and we're both going to figure out, try and answer the God question, among other things, right? Because effectively,
and I would assume that you were on Sam Harris's camp.
I emerged from Sam Harris's camp, but I think all of the academic community is a little bit confused as to why an academic can take such an embrace about compatibility in religion, right? Because a secular community is typically away from that. They distance that self. So somebody who's an academic and a Harvard scholar. I mean, Peterson went to Harvard for a little bit, I believe.
You taught at Harvard, yeah.
Right. So it's shocking that they would make that a part of their platform, I think. And so it's almost like odd. Like people almost want to, like from the academic community, well, why are you doing that?
It's very much not. It's very much not. I would venture to say that if I did more of the research, and I'm thinking of a few, but if I did more of the research, that some of the founders of some of the most popular universities were founded by religious men. So your premise is more of a premise of what had happened to the academic society in the last 50 to 60 years, not the nature.
That's totally what I was saying. Yeah.
Not the nature of actual intellectuals that are battling the existential questions of what really should matter about life. And Jordan Peterson is doing what academics should be doing. And, I have my opinions about Sam Harris, and I listen to him a lot because I really like his logic, although the conclusions he comes to, I don't. And I'm not anyone to even compare myself. But again, as a human being to another human being who, I have to wrestle with my mind. I have to wrestle with my ideas. I can't wrestle with Sam Harris's internal conundrums. Like that's for him to wrestle. For me, and the same is with you. But no, I think Jordan Peterson is right on time with regards to what he's doing with his academic platform, with his academic platform. So,
and if his explosion has anything to do with measuring that, like if that was the litmus test, right? There's, I mean, he's an absolute phenomenon, right?
And he would say that he's like the market has communicated, the world has communicated that there's a hunger for this particular form of communication, long form of communication, meaning human beings, as he would say, are less dumb as we assume them to be in the 60s. Like, let's just create a particular program. Let's have a machine that laughs behind because human beings couldn't do that themselves. So if we're doing a sitcom, like we should even dictate to them when they should laugh, like the stupidity. And there's explanations for it. But no, but I think what it points to is the hunger and the yearning in the crisis of meaning that we're currently in. I think he's more revealing what's underneath the surface than his own inquiries. His own inquiries, I think, are voiced the inquiries of millions of people around the world. The crisis of leadership, the crisis of like, what is the collective narrative that people can stand behind and be willing to live and die for? Like, what is the West, and et cetera, et cetera. So what is suffering?
Yeah, no, I don't actually. Let's dwell on this just for a little bit more, because there's some clarification. My approach with Jordan Peterson is one where the single word that comes to mind for him is courage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I think of Jordan Peterson, there's a Christian apologetic at play that he's advocating towards. Now, from that standpoint, Cal, I go a bit broader spectrum on this, and you know that I spend more time in a Hellenic cultural origin standpoint, right?
Yeah.
So the apologetic that JP is teaching or preaching, right? I'm saying I think that the ideal is to go a little bit wider than that, right? Instead of focusing so much on Christian fundamental values, I personally think that it should be focused more on the classics and more on the Greek origin stories. Okay, but
Interesting.
that's just a matter of, like, if I was building a platform and felt inspired to talk about Dionysus versus Jesus Christ, then I would do that. That's just where I would tend to focus. Now, what's really interesting about the way Jordan Peterson sets this up is that one of his founding first principles is to say, hey, wait a minute, the new atheist types, and you can say from the Four Horsemen onward, right? Because that grappled into something as well as a phenomenon, to say,
yeah,
the propulsion and the thrownness of these people into society, and us receiving that information and acknowledging that people like Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and the late great Hitch, it's like, what was that phenomenon all about? Now, the realization that I've come to realize is that there is a community where that commentary says it's got cult-like tendencies in a way. That's a big statement. I'm not trying to generalize and blanket that, but the idea that Jordan's coming here into the table is he's saying, like, guys, don't throw all of this history away. And
by the way, I have no problem with cults, and I have to say that. The reason why I'm saying it, and let's pause for a second.
Okay.
Because there are people that call the government a cult, and they call Scientology a cult, and they call Jewish Orthodoxy a cult. I think whenever people talk of cults, the internal instinct of tribalism,
right?
Or let's even put it in a positive context. I think the tendency towards nationalism, or the tendency towards pride towards one's people, comes with a defense for it. Comes with a dance and a song with pride. We are different than those. Like, I speak to Jehovah's Witness people all the time. I speak to Christians all the time. I speak to Scientologists all the time. I speak to Orthodox Jews. They all have the same pride about their version being the narrative that will bring humanity towards salvation.
Yeah.
Think about this. Like, I don't know many people, and I know a lot of people, and I'm about to make a very arrogant statement. I don't know many people that are so immersed in these different groups, the different organizations and different communities and religions. And I keep swimming between them, and I'm like, wow, you have your language, you have your, so the reason I'm saying is, like, a lot of people are like, well, I feel like the Christian Orthodox community, or the Catholic community, or the what's it called, the academics, oh, they're kind of like a cult. It doesn't mean anything to me. It's like, so what are you saying? So
because
a lot of times
it actually limits the understanding by labeling it, and that's dangerous. So
the question would be like, which cult is pushing society towards a better and more compassionate world, and which cult is moving it towards destruction? Like, we can arguably say a Marxist view of the world that has a cultish component to it.
Yeah,
they are wanting to abolish a lot of things that have given that. Maybe one episode will take a strong opinion on it, but right now we're going to keep it on a very light, meaning you can arguably say that they want to destroy and do away with that some institutions that have statistically brought a lot of liberation and salvation and wealth and less of suffering for people, versus other systems have brought people into more freedom and a more civilized world. So again, that will be the context if you're talking about conversation, which ideology should be given more credence, because one is destroying civilization as we know it today without a solution for something better. They just want to do away with it. And one has not achieved perfection, but they have arguably done a lot of positive for the world. So when people talk like, oh, they have a cultish component, like with the atheists, they have yes, of course, human beings want to feel like they belong. They want to feel like people have their back. They want to feel that they can go to the other side of the planet. And if they identify as a Christian, I will open my door, because we have an ideology that gives credence. And it's the same with people that believe in evolution and that are very much into secular societies, and they belong to an organization. There's a language, there's common idols, there are common leaders, and we have a framework for civil. I know that you're not going to stab me in the back because you believe in virtue and you believe in positivity and believe in like bettering the world. So you're not going to take anything from me when I close my eyes. Like that happens in literally every community or in every cult or in every. So again, we're using the term here, and I'm trying obviously to make light of the term, because like I arguably grew up in a cult-like community. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community where people dress a particular way, speak a particular way. They're waiting to go into heaven in a particular way. They die in a particular way. They're born in a particular way, very distinctly different from the outside world. So it's like, what makes, I would always go like an inch deeper, being like, okay, they have a cult-like way of being. Great. What are the byproducts of their way of life for the people in it and people around them? Does that make sense?
You know what? I'm gonna bring up a statement. I want to let you get me. Let me get to the end of the statement, because I think you're gonna be excited by it. So,
okay.
There's a part of, but you can't answer this question yet. Let me get to the end, and you'll know. So, are you still an Orthodox Jew? And one of my someone I'm really impressed with is why is his name escaping me now? He's part of that IDW crew. He's an Orthodox Jew.
Ben Shapiro.
Ben Shapiro, yeah. Why did I forget that name? How can you forget Ben Shapiro?
So much about him in the last few days with different other.
What a powerhouse intellect, right? And what really is interesting, and then I'll come up for air and let you kind of like jump onto the thought of Ben Shapiro and what your thoughts are about him. But I'm thoroughly impressed with him, because his I don't have a cultural identity with the Jewish faith. I don't. I just simply don't. And then I don't have, even more so, not an Orthodox Jewish faith. But what I do is I understand.
Were your parents or grandparents Jewish at all?
No.
Okay.
Most of my favorite authors are, by the way.
Yeah. That's awesome. We should talk about that one day.
The people of the book, right? It's just like, one of my favorite authors was the late George Steiner, polymath and polyglot, and just an incredible mind. But anyways, the point is that, tell me a little bit about Ben Shapiro, and why he's so relevant to bring back some traditional Orthodox, as you say, cultish practices.
There's a few things that I want to say about Ben Shapiro. So one, I'm grateful for him, and I'm appreciative of him that he had the intellectual integrity and also the audacity. When he writes his books, he doesn't just focus on Judaism. Like one of his last books that I read was, what was it about? It was something along the lines of why the West is as great as it is, like the combination of Jerusalem and what's a little.
Well, there was the right side of history. I read that one. Was that the one?
Yeah. I think I have it in the other room, but the right side of history. But he brings Christian. He explains the West. So in explaining the West, you have to say it's a combination of Judaic Christian values. And then you have to kind of go a bit further of like, what makes Judaic, what makes Christian values, and where did they come? Where did they originate? What was the city in Rome? Or, God, I can't believe that it's completely Jerusalem and Athens and Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah.
But it's like,
So what he's doing is and then I'm saying there's not enough emphasis on but
I know, but you made a good point. I thought of that when you mentioned that earlier, and I would venture to say that when Jordan Peterson talks about Western civilization, he's taken the same stance as Ben Shapiro. He's talking about how Athens and Jerusalem now make up the West, and you and I know, well, it's common knowledge to know that for the forefathers of our country, not what we consider the forefathers, but the settlers and many years prior to the forming of our country, or here in the United States, here in Canada, saw this piece of land as the promised land. And again, the important part is not the promised land. The important part is, for them, the finding of the New World was a biblical reference. For them, it was the ability to actually implement and practice the principles of the Bible, where in England that was being stifled in a church. So for them to come here under to be able to practice religious freedoms was a religious thing. It was the again, and that's how the United States evolved, and what we consider the West today is the combination of those two. But back to Ben Shapiro, and I'm probably lost my train of thought for a moment, but back to Ben Shapiro, I appreciate as an identified Orthodox Jew that he's not just going to defend the Bible or the Talmud or Jewish mysticism or Zionism, but he is coming from a place of, no, let's see what's great about the West. And that's not just the United States. What's great about freedom of speech? What's so great about the freedom of religion? What's so great about the freedom to assemble, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Why was our country set up the way it is? And how much greater can we be if we continue in this trend? Destroying it wouldn't do any good, because we haven't seen a better alternative. Yeah, there's always going to be the argument of, which I think is absolutely horrific, the argument that, well, maybe it's going to work this time. If we destroy everything that possibly works, maybe the next iteration of Marxism, of socialism, of communism could be a better version, but we don't have any proof. So if we have to live in a society for just a second, that we look to the past to determine what could work in the future, we certainly don't have a system that we can say, oh, let's use a different system. Now, I'm always going to be willing to say, not only am I going to be willing to say, I live my life today like my future could look like, very different than anything what my past looked like. Yeah. I'll repeat that, meaning I live my life with a sense of possibility that tomorrow could be an entirely better world for me, and it doesn't have to look like my past. So perhaps civilization and society could do that as well. But where the conversations will get fiery and where the conversations will get relevant would be, could it be done with murder, rape, stealing, aggression, more pain? I don't know. It's certainly not the case in one's individual life. Meaning, can tomorrow look better? Yes, but I have to start with today with more principle, more steadfastness, more compassion, more love, thinking of more togetherness, more adding value to the world. It certainly does not happen with, let me kill every one of my past, internally and externally. So yes, okay, so back to Ben Shapiro, I really appreciate that component of him, and I do admire his not hiding his religiosity, and he's just an incredibly smart dude.
Yeah,
he speaks insanely fast. You know, even talking about Ben Shapiro has me speaking faster. You notice that? You think of Ben Shapiro, you just want to talk faster because you want to get information faster, and so. But he's just insanely smart, and he's been able to take a stand for cultural important topics and also not shy away from his religiosity. So back to your question of like, where do I stand in it? My story is not over yet. And I think that's obvious, but it's very important to me, because I wake up in the morning and I say a Jewish prayer. Before I go to sleep, I say a Jewish prayer, or I say a Hebrew prayer. I wake up and I do some practices that are very religious in nature and very Jewish in nature, and I have a strong affinity in connection to its narrative. So far that I can even say that if you had if I was out in public with a few thousand people and I was told, defy your religion and deny it, I would let my body be cut into pieces publicly and be taken piece by piece while alive before I would deny the thing that I feel is the focal point of my soul.
Wow.
So again, that's a bit extreme. It's like, it's not like, oh, do you believe in God? It's what do you like?
No,
so I have a strong affinity to it.
Wow.
And also I don't live my life as a religious Jew, but I have this like deep, like I've sat and done those practices frequently where I end up sobbing, crying like a little child, like yearning for a togetherness of a people and of a creator. Now, I am not convinced that every human being in the world doesn't have that experience. I don't know. We might interpret it differently. We might have a different frame of reference. So perhaps the human experience is very similar. We just experience it differently. We express it differently based on how we were raised and the cultural reference points that we have, the personal narrative that we find ourselves in. But I have this deep-rooted, constant conversation with what I would identify as the supreme, as the sublime, as something that gives life to me on an ongoing basis. Yeah. And dictates every aspect of my life, and that wants me to co-create with it, and wants me to be active in the world in creating my future, etc., etc. So I've realized recently that I'm using the word etc., way too much. So I have to be conscious of that.
No, okay. So let me see if I can. I love that, Kal. I think that's a really great and passionate explanation. It actually makes it very clear, and I think listeners are going to really identify with that passion. I had a podcast that I did with somebody from Iran, Muslim faith.
Yeah.
Individual, right? And I tried to flush out something in the conversation that I thought would be the best defense for him in terms of justifying religion. And I think that this piece of advice could then be ported over to yourself, and then also, to say somebody who is where, say, Christianity is so centric to their worldview, right? Okay. Right. So it kind of goes like this, is that I'm sitting here inhabiting a space, a conversation, we're building a friendship together, but Kal is making manifest, like he is embodying his culture, right? So everything that is your identity is passing through that lens and that filter of an Orthodox Jewish structure, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, if that not threatened, because threatened is a weird way. That's saying someone's going to take. But if you imagine yourself without that piece, what the agreement that I came to this Muslim fellow, is he's like, I can't imagine myself like that. I can't imagine my psychology, my cognition. That wouldn't be Kal. That wouldn't be, this fellow's name was Dawood, right? So it's cut so close to the core of who you are that if you didn't have that, you wouldn't be Kal. And then I said to him, I go, you kind of like Kal, don't you? Or you like Dawood? And she'd say, wait a minute, I like me. I like who I am. I like how I think, how I project my feelings in the relationship that I have internally in my head. And it doesn't, from that standpoint, I don't mean it as a pejorative. I don't mean that this is a, but
no, the very nature of how we live our lives.
And think exactly.
We live our lives in a narrative. Yeah,
that's right. And it's a narrative that is it's so entwined with my identity that I don't want to give that up. Like you use you're very graphic, like someone could cut me up to pieces before I would give that up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I think like when you see these kind of like entry level conversations about let's have a debate and let's talk about whether God exists or doesn't, and it's almost like the atheist community brings such a silly response to the conversation and says, Cal, how could you think that there's a guy with a long beard that sits up in the sky and then watches over you and goes, oh, Cal, you're doing something wrong today.
Yeah,
this is ridiculous. Like it's not even a good argument of understanding, right? It's not
right.
like I'm like, come on, guys, secular community, you can do better than that. And if you actually try and understand the two, then you can actually see there's more overlap than you think there is.
A lot more. I would venture to say that they believe in the same God and
They just don't
call
want
it
to call
something else. They call it rationale.
They just don't want to call it anything.
Yeah, they don't want to call it. They have assumptions about what God is, and based on those assumptions, they've built an entire ideology of rejecting it. So it's like, well, you deny the God that you've created. I also don't believe in the God that you created. So that's fine. Like, we both don't believe in that God that you created, which is that there's some dude sitting up there in a long beard. It's like, where did Santa Claus end up in this conversation?
Yeah,
and like, exactly. And why is it a dude? And why is it a beard? And why is it wise? Yeah. And why is it up there? And what are you talking about? Why couldn't it be the totality of existence and its intelligence? And no one is going to debate that a tulip takes more intelligence to grow than what we can wrap our minds around, because we can't even explain it. You'd be like, oh, it happens. And maybe it's not up there or down there, and maybe it's not the beginning and an end. And it's a longer conversation, a theological conversation that we can have until we die. But it's, of course, I don't believe in the God the atheist denies.
Can they not understand poetry and metaphor? Can they not of course
or
they
emotion
can, right?
And tribalism and defending something that is important. Like for a lot of them, it's like, oh, it's about the freedom human beings should be able to express themselves and go beyond and not live in these like archaic beliefs. And like, yeah, we all want that. Like, every cell of our body is evolving and constantly progressing to something better. But again, it's not the whole story. There's a lot more to it. So
okay, so how do we pivot? Because we want to, like, we're gonna. I think we're gonna try and keep it to about an hour. We got 20 minutes. We got to bring it all back. I mean, look, there's an underpinning of suffering, but I think we can get more explicit in what we're talking about in regards to suffering, right? Yeah. So where do we pivot at this point to thematically?
I think there's a great pivoting here. We can start with one thing, which is back to the great sage of Jordan Peterson.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And again, I'm just using it because he's articulated this conversation a lot. And I think every religion does. Like, the invitation of life is that your life is so worth living that it lives in a context so significant and relevant that you can tolerate the suffering that you're having. So there's a way of saying is like, if suffering was something that awakens you to faith, or if suffering awakens one to seeing what is working in your life, what do you have gratitude about? If suffering is the thing that awakens you to clean your room, clean your life, clean your past. If suffering is something to be, okay, what is neurologically happening? Meaning, if I'm suffering and I'm thinking about what I'm suffering and I'm pissed off that I'm suffering and I'm aware that I'm suffering, guess what? I'm going to have more suffering. But if I'm suffering and I go, okay, this is not how I want it to be, but it also could be different. How would I want it to be different? And what would it look like? And what could I do right now in the most nuanced, incremental fashion to get to this better world? Now, all of a sudden, the very suffering was the cross that one bears. The suffering now becomes the very thing that is a reminder, what is the ideal you want to live yourself toward? How can you make your life better? And when I say about faith, faith is not the dude up there feeling his beard. The faith is now, do I believe that as a human being, that I could experience something that I'm not currently experiencing, that I can get excited about co-creating. And I see that in my life right now in many different ways. So it's not answering what is suffering, but I think we are starting to flush out the idea of what kind of life would be worth living and would be worth embracing the suffering that someone is suffering.
Well, that's interesting. And even prior to that, I think you touched on this, is I would say, okay, does this ring true if I say, because you brought up the idea of Jesus and the cross, that he's bearing his own suffering. So the lesson is, and I didn't really actually use Jesus as with that particular heuristic in mind. But let me see if this kind of fits. If I said that it's up to every individual to bear their own suffering, it's really not anybody else's responsibility. Is kind of but it's you have to accept your own suffering, right? That's step one. And if you don't accept your own suffering, if you project it on your neighbor, if you project it over here, this is just
society or your past. Right? Yeah.
So that's a huge lesson from our good friend, Mr. JC, I suppose, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you reconcile JC as an Orthodox Jew, though? How do you?
Well, again, I don't identify myself as an Orthodox Jew. I grew up Orthodox,
right,
and very observant. But how do I reconcile it? I think if I was sitting at a table with a rabbi, obviously he will have his opinion of like where historically Jesus is and what he is, and from their standpoint, I could very much see how he's the other, he's the rebel, he is misidentifying what is truth. And I am not that intelligent, I'm not that awake, and I'm not that divine to take that stand, nor do I have the authority to say that, to do so. But as a human being, when I have listened to teachings, when I've read the New Testament, when I've watched other human beings go through this sincere desire to better themselves and the sincere desire to live up to a higher ideal, for me, my best interpretation would be like Jesus is this ideal. It's the ideal form of the human being. We don't, it's what we strive for. We don't, the goal isn't to arrive at it. The goal isn't to be there all the time. The goal is to incrementally better our lives. So if you ask me as a Jew, he's not the only one that demonstrates that. Viktor Frankl, living through the Holocaust, represents that to me. My grandfather represents that to me, who survived the Holocaust, helped thousands of people escape Nazi Germany, and then after the Holocaust did not give up faith on humanity, but sat with hundreds and thousands of people, crying with them, holding their hands, listening to their stories, and helped them get back into their lives, get on with their lives and heal. So for me, Jesus Christ is that representation. Now, let's get controversial. I can say that Muhammad represents that. Now, maybe if I was sitting with someone who practices the Islamic religion, and he could enlighten me, or he or she can enlighten me with regards to the Quran. But as far as I know, there's a lot more violence, him as a person. And it's kind of like, this is our way and everyone else should be either converted or killed. And let's overthrow every other society. I can't get behind that. I think ultimately, if taken to its extreme, is the annihilation of me and my people. So it will be absolutely insane to take a stand for it. But again, the easiest answer for you would be, I don't take a liking and an aspiration, or even using imagery and narrative of Jesus Christ or Christianity as a religious Jew. I just take it as a human being who has extreme fondness for idealism. I think you will find that same aspiration and the same admiration for philosophers that you look up, that were pondering, what are we doing here? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What constitutes good living? What should our ideal focal point toward a better life look like? So I think, like, if you were describing those individuals, I think you would most likely speak with the same reverence towards those characters.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd probably, this conversation is fantastic, because I know as we, wind down to the last 10 minutes or so, we're going to come back. We're going to do another episode. There's just so much material. I can tell you're lit up, and there's so many different ways we can take this. We could bring in clips of Jordan Peterson. We could do a few highlights of Ben Shapiro. We can do some commentary. We can bring some text in. You know what, Kal? I'd love to hear what the prayers are in the morning. Like, what is it that? Because I love tradition, right? I mean, if someone says that I have like a self-help book that I read every morning and it really helps me do it, and I think, well, wait a minute, like, there's some tradition here. Why don't you follow something that was a little bit more anchored in history, has a historical background, has a cultural background, rather than something that just arbitrarily emerged out of, like, in the recent, like, 100 years or something like that, right? So anyways, I mean, find
you and I can literally sit here for an hour and answer this question alone. And I maybe we'll do that. Maybe one day we'll do a conversation on ritual, and we can dive into it more. But one of the things that I do is going to be so apropos to this conversation. You're going to be like, how is it all sound the same? It's like it comes together. So yes, I put on tefillin and I say Hebrew prayers, and we can come back to that. But one of the things that I do when I sit down for my morning meditation, I say a verse, and I'll say it to you in Hebrew, and then I'll dissect it. And it goes, Hareini mekabel olai et ha'ol malchut shemayim. And what does that mean? Hareini mekabel olai, I accept on myself, et ha'ol, the yoke of the fear of heaven. So it would be like, I accept on myself the yoke, the burden, or the responsibility of the kingdom of heaven, which is such a mistranslation in English, because Malchut Shemayim is the kingdom of heaven, but Shemayim, the word Shemayim in Hebrew is Esh V'Mayim, water and fire. You're like, okay, so when you reference heaven, you're referencing water and fire. Like, what does that even mean? So for me, what it translates as, like, I accept on myself the kingship of the impossible.
Wow.
The kingship of what seems contradictory. The kingship of what literally looks insane. Like, you go into your life and you see a homeless person laying on the floor drunk in his own piss, and you're like, in a world where there's insane amount of beauty, that exists. In a world where I want to feed hungry people, I sometimes want to slaughter somebody. You're like, what? In a world where I do everything right, I get screwed over. You're like, so to start my day with, like, I voluntarily, and that's a whole nother hours of what Jordan Peterson goes into. Like, I can suffer involuntarily and be resentful about it, or I can just take it on, accept it. And that's back to Jesus Christ, and that's back to the cross, and that's voluntarily suffering in the world. Again, conversation is what is suffering. I willingly accept on myself right now, newly, the burden of the impossible. So I start my day every day like that. So every day I get to say again, okay, whatever is so confusing about my life, and sometimes the disappointment of not being where I want to be, and not having what I want to have, and not having the kind of relationship with my kids that I want to have, and wanting to be closer to my parents, and wanting to, on and on and on, wanting to clean up my past in a way that I've only wanted but haven't been able to live up to. Like, I'm a human being that is far from being the person that I want to be. So every day I with nuance, every day I move closer to it. But the prayer is like, Hareini Mekabel Olai, I accept on myself, like willingly. Like regardless of what's happening, I'm going to be at cause. So I'm aware. My organs don't ask me if they can function. My brain doesn't ask me for permission to be alive. But like this morning when I'm laying in meditation and I'm feeling my body, I'm on the floor. I do a meditation for an hour every day, and I do it laying down. It's a guided meditation. And all of a sudden I'm aware, like the sensations I'm feeling are there, and it's like, who's making it do what it's doing? Like, where's it coming from? Like, I'm aware of my thoughts, but am I picking my thoughts? Did I place it in there? It's like
they just emerge, right? They just come.
They emerge. They show up. They show up in a space. So the mystery of things is just absolutely mind blowing. But again, and then you go through your day, and then someone cuts you off while driving, and you're not getting somewhere fast enough, and your bank account isn't where you want it to be, and you're like, "Urgh." The body just does what it does in reaction, and then there's suffering again. But then if I could, the idea of doing a daily and ritual is all of a sudden it's transforming my life. What does that mean? It's creating new neurological pathways in my brain, and it's so fundamental, and it's so real. Like, it cannot be more real, meaning if a thought keeps happening and it keeps happening and it keeps happening, I'm going to have it more frequently, and it's going to give me new emotions, and it's going to give me more new feelings, and it's going to give me a new outlook on life, and it's going to attract different people, and I'm going to show up to the world differently. I'm going to be more hospitable to the world, and all of a sudden new opportunities will be able to show up, and I'll be able to be present for them, and I'll be able to respond to them, and I'll be able to get on its ride, and I'll be able to get the byproducts of it. It's so fundamental and real. You'd be like, well, that's just a prayer. Are you praying to God? No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm praying to remember the God that I am, that is the same as every human being.
Yeah.
It's praying to the potential that we can become. So there is no beard, some dude out there. It's not. I love your description of it. It's like, hey.
Well, I love the response of Santa Claus. It's funny. It's comical, because it's like, come on, guys, can't we do better than this? How far we've come. And Kal can spend, 5 minutes explaining something that's so visceral and so even real in terms of a neurological standpoint, right? You just explained about the myelination in the brain, right? And so if it's like, fine, if you don't want to take the metaphors, if you don't want to take the analogies, what's the most effective way to myelinate in the way that Kal does? Just from the pure, reconciling the world and the experiences that we're seeing. How do you do it? Well, I don't know. Kal seems to have a good way to do that. Maybe you should listen to him. I mean, anyways, I'm kind of being, but I understand. I think that's pretty powerful. On that, should we wrap it up and
let's wrap it up and tell individuals that we want to hear your feedback. We want to hear what you want to hear more about. This was literally Dan and I going out in the fields with some tools to plant and say, okay, what's going to happen here? Are we going to find rocks? Are we going to find some good soil? What seeds are we going to put in? Who's going to enjoy the fruit of our labor? How much of it do we want to plant? How frequently? So this is an exploration, and I love and I'm appreciative to you that you invited this conversation to take place on this platform, like the logo that you created, the topic we came up together, and so I appreciate. And I would venture to say there's something about you that invites this conversation out of me that I feel so excited to share about it. And that's unique. We're going to come back to this topic, but that's unique. That's like,
it's a charged topic, my friend. And on that note,
but it's not just a topic, it's you. That's what I'm saying. It is you in the sense of the whole Rigerian idea of like, the observer dictates what's being observed. Two people being in a conversation and bringing the best out of in each other is a skill, and it's made up of a particular substance.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess that's my way of saying that I appreciate you.
I do. I'd give you a hug, man, but we're several
virtually
miles
hugging.
away. All right, Kal, until next time, let's, stay safe and, shoulder that burden wisely. And hopefully there's people around to share that with you. A multiplicity for sure.
Absolutely. Have a great weekend. We're going to talk soon.
Okay. Thanks, man.
All right. Bye-bye.